Hi, it's Carol Salter here reading from her book Witch on the Warpath. This week we're looking at chapter 16, but I have had some good feedback I thought you might like to hear first. A gentleman told me he loved listening to it. It reminded him of when he was a child and his mother used to read to him. Unfortunately, he does find himself falling to sleep quite often when he listens to it. So a recommendation there for anybody who might have sleep problems. Please recommend my book to them. Chapter 16, chapter 15, we left Hearty in a lot of trouble, bound up by a spider with two villains and a Neath demon about to kidnap him into the Neath realm. Let's see what happens in chapter 16, Krog. Onk had missed Hearty after a few hours the previous day. He was used to Hearty flying off when they reached their destination in search of a comfy nest, but he always returned as dusk turned to twilight. When he failed to appear, Onk felt the first stirrings of unease. He couldn't express his concerns verbally, so he settled for pacing about in a truculent manner, marching up and down the cemetery paths. Sometimes he marched under the very tree where Hearty was imprisoned. His step was so heavy with worry he'd created a number of dents in the aged path. Stamping about didn't make him feel any better, and it didn't make Hearty reappear, so Onk sat down to have a think. Having missed 2 of his daily naps, Onk promptly dropped into his nighttime slumber, utilising a litter bin as a pillow. He rose in the early dawn, and after his exercises, which resulted in even more dents in the paths, he realised his relatively new friend was still missing. Onk wasn't used to worrying about anybody else. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling, making his head ache and his tummy wobble. He deliberated on Hearty's whereabouts. Hearty wasn't the type of elf to leave without saying goodbye. Not that Onk knew any other elves and fairies by name. Though they'd only known each other a short while, Onk was developing something like an affection for the little man. Something must have happened to Hearty to prevent him returning, he concluded. The conclusion ramped Onk's worry level up another notch. He needed to locate Hearty, and Onk's instincts told him he needed to do it fast. He raced back to the last place he'd been made welcome for help. Tiny and Robin were washing in a small concrete bird bath in the children's section of their cemetery home when Onk found them. It was Robin's turn, and he was making quite a song and dance of it, thought Onk as he arrived, puffing and blowing. Onk's annual bath involved wading into a big river and out the other side. All this flittering and fluttering till your feathers fell out in the water was unnecessary to Onk's way of thinking. Despite his breathlessness, he watched the robin, amazed by his captivating performance, and completely forgot why he'd returned. "Hello, Onk," said Tiny, surprised to see the big fellow back in Putney Vale so soon after he left. "I thought you two were going east," he said, looking over Onk's shoulder for Hearty. "Where's Hearty?" "I can't see him, but that doesn't mean much with my terrible eyesight." "Hearty gone," said Onk, the misery clear in his tone. "Gone?" repeated Tiny. "Gone where?" he asked, thinking Onk meant gone temporarily, shopping or washing or some such. "Gone," repeated Onk. "Woof," he added, using the word he'd heard Tiny use when he lost Robin. "Not woof," uttered Tiny, a horrified expression filling his face. Onk nodded his shaggy head in affirmation, trying to make his eyes look as sad as possible, which Onk thought was particularly hard given his incredible good looks. "Let's go," said Tiny, launching himself onto Onk's left shoulder as Robin, his friend and companion, landed on Onk's right one, a sopping wet ball of brown and red feathers. Onk laughed out loud. He was so pleased at their immediate reaction. His great shoulders jerked up and down, threatening to unseat both of them. Once he'd stopped laughing, he wiped the tears from his eyes, and grinning at each in turn, Onk launched into a steady lope rather than the sprint of earlier, running back to the place he'd last seen Hearty without stopping once. When they arrived at Crystal Palace Park, Onk slowed in front of the children's play area. "Is this the last place you saw Hearty?" questioned Tiny, perched like a skinny parrot on Onk's left shoulder. Robin, seasick to the beak, hopped onto a nearby rhododendron bush before he was physically sick. Onk looked about to confirm the location, then nodded once. "Okay, Robin, you take the high canopy and I'll ask the individual trees." Onk was pleased that he'd asked the two of them to help, especially as Tiny seemed to know precisely what to do. Exhausted from both his runs, Onk sat down onto the grass for a few minutes of well-earned rest, while Tiny and Robin took up the role of seekers. Tiny spent most of the afternoon talking to various trees in the gardens. To do this, an elf needed to have a much closer contact with a tree than when sharing energy. Through the bark, an elf could sense emotions like fear and pleasure, which was the method favoured for most contact. But if an elf wanted to speak to a tree, then a closer sap-to-sap union was required. Most of the time this was relatively easy to achieve. Trees often lost pieces of bark and branches in the course of their long lives. If not, an elf could resort to making a cut or breaking a small twig to gain access. Speaking to so many trees proved to be quite a laborious process. The first 5 trees had no memory of Hearty, but the 6th, an oak, thought he recalled a mulberry elf in his upper branches the day before. He remembered because the kindly elf had healed a wound on his main trunk despite him finding no place to rest. From the oak's information, it was easy to triangulate Hearty's movements. Reaching out in ever-widening circles, Tiny followed the trail Hearty had left ingrained in the trees he touched in his search for a bed for the night. Tiny was doing well until he came across a solitary hawthorn tree. Here the trail went cold. Like a bloodhound, Tiny and Robin, who had joined him from above, backtracked. Onk followed the two of them once he'd rested, curious at their antics and wanting his friend Hearty back. Retracing their steps brought Tiny back to the same hawthorn tree. The tree was comatose. He searched for signs of a break in the bark where he could communicate. Squinting up at the higher branches, Tiny spotted what he thought was a superb bowl hole, and he knew without a doubt that Hearty, with his perfect vision, would have seen it too. He called over to Robin. "Look up there, Robin. I bet Hearty went in there." He pointed to the upper region of the tree. Robin didn't like it. The tree had a nasty, greasy feel to it, all gnarly and cruel. Whistling his displeasure, he tried to warn Tiny off, but Tiny was determined to check out the potential resting place. Robin watched his lifelong friend fly up to the hole in the hawthorn tree and land on the rim. When Tiny vanished without a backward glance or a wave to him, Robin knew something was wrong. Onk had been watching too and became more interested when Tiny disappeared. He moved over to stand next to the hawthorn tree. Tiny had taken one step forward on the rim in order to turn around and wave reassuringly at Robin when his foot slipped and he careered down the polished wood inside. 1 second he was standing on the edge, the next he was sitting on a pile of soft green moss at the bottom of the hole. He was surprised but unhurt by the fall. The nest was a perfect retreat, and Tiny could see Hearty being attracted to it. He could feel Hearty's energy too. He'd spent some time in here, probably stayed the night. But it didn't explain why he hadn't told Onk and let him know where he was. Tiny soon found out why, and he understood the situation a little better when he realised he was unable to climb or fly out again. Luckily for Tiny, Robin had become so agitated and fearful at his sudden disappearance that he'd flown up to the hole to see what was taking him so long. "Why wasn't he coming out?" he twittered. "Don't land, Robin!" Tiny called out when he heard, then saw his friend's wings approaching. He was worried Robin would fall victim to the same trap. Robin obeyed his friend's instructions to the letter, hovering above the hole while cheeping in frantic concern. "Find some string or something to pull me out," he yelled up to Robin. Robin took off so fast he almost collided with Onk, who decided he was missing out on all the fun, had started to climb the lower branches of the comatose tree. The tree stirred in its slumbers, groaning with the weight of a troll. Robin found a length of ivy creeper growing round a nearby post. He pulled and tugged, flying this way and that, until one end came away. With his beak he pecked through a section roughly 3 feet long. Back at the tree, Tiny had spied the spider and recognised he was in the same trouble as Hearty earlier. Unlike Hearty, Tiny was armed. As a holly elf, he always carried several thorn weapons on his person. He had fought spiders before, though not as large as this one, peering down at him, judging by the size of its eyes. Hoping Robin would return soon, he readied his weapons, and standing flat against the wooden wall, he waited. Robin returned, dragging the creeper in his tiny talons, the great winding thing many times bigger than him. By now Onk had climbed onto a branch nearest the hole and was trying to peer in without success into the small entrance. Robin landed next to Onk, carrying his prize. Robin planned to dangle the creeper into the hole, but he wasn't sure how to get Tiny out. He was far too heavy for Robin to lift alone. Maybe Tiny could climb out. Seeing Onk on the branch gave Robin an idea. He lay the length of creeper along the branch, with one end near Onk's hand. He chirruped and hopped lightly as thistledown straight into Onk's open hand. It was a risky move for any Robin. It could have been disaster, resulting in a Robin pancake if Onk had wiped his hand, as one might do out of reflex if a bug landed. To Onk, Robin could very well be a bug. Onk looked down at Robin in his outstretched hand, the thought of food never far from his mind. Instead, he smiled, recognising the bravery of the little bird who fluffed up his feathers to look more intimidating than he felt. It only succeeded in making him look cuter. Onk's smile broke into a wide grin. Robin was so scared he nearly left a token of his bravery, or fear, depending on which way you looked at it, in Onk's palm. He managed to control his body urges, watching with utter relief as Onk bent over and picked up the creeper, saying "pretty" to Robin as he did so. Onk threaded the creeper down into the hole. It was like watching a monkey catching termites with a stick. At least a very large monkey, or maybe a gorilla. Out came Tiny, glued to the end and trembling with gratitude. It had gotten nasty in there for a couple of moments. Whilst Tiny was waiting for Robin to organise his rescue, the large black spider had descended from the funnel hole above. Spidey wasn't fast enough to catch Tiny out, who used to fighting spiders, but quick enough to scare him all the same. Tiny jabbed at the spider's legs with his thorn spear, and eventually the beast backed off. It wasn't finished with him, though. It hunkered down, decided on a new strategy. It had fought pointy things before, and this one wasn't going to stop him collecting his fly reward. Staying well away from Tiny's weapons, the spider sat above him, outside its funnel, spinning a web. It was a web net to catch Tiny in, and he knew it. "Hurry up, Robin!" fretted Tiny. "Whatever you're going to do out there, do it fast!" The net was almost finished and ready to cast when Onk pushed the creeper into the hole. Tiny, in his relief and panic to get away, ran towards it, just as the spider threw the net. The net wrapped round Tiny's thin legs, and it stuck to the creeper. The spider didn't stand a chance against Onk. When he felt a tug on his end, he just yanked the creeper out of the hole, along with Tiny, the net, and the surprised spider. The spider dangled from the end of its net, terrified at being exposed. It dropped as fast as it could down through the branches, using its silk to abseil. Robin was having none of it. In one graceful swoop he snipped the silken thread, leaving the spider to fall unchecked to the ground below. From such a great height it landed stunned, and Onk grabbed it after he jumped out the tree. Moving to a nearby bin, he rammed the stunned spider into an empty drinks can and stuffed paper into the opening as a bung. Once Tiny had recovered from his near-death experience at the legs of the spider, and Onk had given the drugged tree a darn good shaking to wake it up, it was simple enough, though lengthy, task to locate Hearty using information gathered from the petrified spider and the repentant tree. As the three heroes gathered their intel in the early evening, Hearty lay bound up in the park shed nearby, about to be forced into the Neath realms by obnoxious adolescent demons. "What's yous two gulping at?" screamed the toddler-sized demon, its voice scratchy and hard. "Grabs his feet and push him through!" The reluctant duo rose as one, with Krog grasping Hearty's head. The two of them picked up Hearty's feet in preparation for launching him into the inky blackness beyond. They moved, cautious about the tear between the realms. It frightened them, for in theory they might be pulled through and eaten too. "What's it with yous?" asked Krog, losing his patience with his incompetent henchman. "I's taking his head, see? You just hold him still, and when I say push, you push him through, okay?" They nodded, struck dumb by fear. Krog shook his head. He wasn't sure if they were scared or just plain stupid. Maybe he'd take them as well next time. He couldn't wait to get back home to his dark dimension. It was way too bright here, and the smell. How could anyone live like this? It smelt horrible, almost clean. Ugh. He shuddered in revulsion. Krog stepped backwards through the tear first. One red leg, then the other, holding Hearty's head none too gently in his dirty hands. The bottom half of Krog's body was safely in the Neath realms, the top half in Earth's dimensions. The tarmac orc and the wingless fairy held Hearty's legs, ready to push the remainder of him through, when Onk arrived at the shed door, or more accurately, through it. The door exploded inwards in a shower of splinters and soil. Onk ground to a halt, sending a massive spray of earth across the shed's interior in every direction. Dirt covered everything and everyone. Krog took one petrified look at the angry city troll bearing down on him and muttered, "I'm out of here." Beginning the procedure to seal the tear, he let Hearty's head drop on the floor. Hearty wanted to mumble a painful ouch as the back of his head struck the floor hard, but he couldn't. The two remaining villains gazed around the shed for an escape route, letting go of Hearty's feet like they were logs on fire. There was no way out, except the Neath realms, and neither fancied their chances there based on Krog's diet. And besides, the tear was already too small. They retreated in terror to the far wall, a damp patch appearing on the orc's trousers. We'll see what happens to them next time when Onk dishes out his judgment. Stay tuned. Goodbye.